Snow fell softly over Winterbury, blanketing the streets in an immaculate white layer. The Christmas lights flickered lazily on the scattered houses across town, but something was off that night. It wasn't just the absence of people on the streets, it was the absolute silence that enveloped everything. Even the church bells, which always rang to mark Christmas Eve, remained quiet. Sarah Whitmore, a 32-year-old electrical engineer who had recently moved to the town, drove slowly down one of the main avenues. The hum of her car's engine was the only sound breaking the eerie stillness around her. She glanced at the clock on the dashboard. Midnight was only a few hours away, and the phone call she had received 15 minutes ago still echoed in her mind. The mayor of the town, a man named Thomas Everett, had personally called her, urgently requesting her help. "The town lights are failing in a strange way," he had said, his voice more anxious than it should have been for a mere electrical issue. "We need them fixed before the event at the square." Sarah parked her car near the Central Park, where a giant Santa Claus statue dominated the landscape. The figure looked grotesque under the flickering lights, its white beard glowing in orange tones as shadows danced around it. Grabbing her toolbox, she stepped out of the car, the sound of her boots crunching against the snow the only thing filling the void. The town seemed frozen in time, and Sarah felt a chill run up her spine. As she walked toward the main light pole, where the wires connected to the park's power system, she noticed something peculiar. The lights weren't flickering randomly, they were too organized to be a simple malfunction. Getting closer, she opened the control box at the base of the pole and adjusted the beam of her flashlight. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance. The cables were intact, and the power flow appeared normal. That's when she realized the lights weren't flickering due to a lack of power. They were blinking in a rhythm, almost like a code. Sarah frowned, leaning in to study them more closely. Her trained mind quickly began identifying repetitions in the pattern. She pulled out her phone, recording a video of the lights and mentally noting the intervals. Something didn't add up. Who would set something like this up on Christmas Eve? And why? As she worked, the sound of footsteps crunching through the snow behind her made her turn. Standing there was Mayor Everett, a short and stocky man bundled in a heavy coat and a red scarf. He looked uneasy, constantly glancing over his shoulder as if expecting something, or someone, to appear out of the shadows. "Have you found anything?" he asked, his voice lower than usual. Sarah explained that the lights were blinking in a pattern that could be a code, but she avoided going into detail until she could decipher exactly what it meant. Everett frowned, clearly disturbed by the idea. "We don't have time for this," he said, rubbing his gloved hands together. "People are already talking about the outages and other things. We need this fixed before anyone starts spreading rumors." "Other things?" Sarah asked, but Everett quickly dismissed the question, saying it was just paranoia from the older residents. He suggested she check the generators located at the side of the park while he went to calm some nerves at the town hall. Sarah didn't press further, but she couldn't ignore the worried look on his face as he walked away. Following Everett's instructions, Sarah made her way to a small shed at the edge of the park where the generators were housed. The shed was locked, but she used the keys she had been given when she was hired for the town's maintenance work. As she opened the door, the smell of burnt oil filled the air, but the generators were running perfectly. That ruled out any issues with the main power system. So why were the lights acting so strangely? She stepped out of the shed, her eyes drawn back to the Santa Claus statue in the distance. The lights around the park continued blinking insistently. It felt like something there was trying to be understood, like a message waiting to be deciphered. Pulling out her phone again, Sarah recorded more of the blinking lights, resolving to analyze the patterns later at home. But before she could leave, she heard a peculiar sound, a low humming, coming from the direction of the statue. Sarah hesitated, looking around to confirm she was alone. The park was empty, the silence around her almost deafening. Following the hum, she reached the base of the statue, kneeling to inspect the wires that ran through it. That's when she noticed something buried under the snow, near Santa's feet. It was metallic, and the light reflected off its surface caught her eye. With freezing fingers, Sarah began digging the snow away from the object. After a few minutes, she uncovered what appeared to be a circular lid, firmly secured to the ground. There was an inscription etched along the edge, but the layer of ice made it difficult to read. Rubbing the surface with her hands, she managed to make out the words, "For those who seek answers." Her chest tightened, her heart pounding faster. The humming stopped abruptly, and the lights around the park went out briefly, plunging the area into complete darkness. When they came back on, the blinking pattern had changed again, this time faster, almost frantic. It was as if something was urging her to continue. Taking one last look around, Sarah grabbed her tools and began working on the lid. The metal was frozen and stubborn, but with effort, she managed to loosen it. When the lid finally came off, it revealed a small compartment below, housing a metallic capsule. She pulled it out, the icy surface burning through her gloves. Without hesitation, Sarah took the capsule back to her car. As she drove home, the words etched on the lid echoed in her mind, "For those who seek answers." But answers to what? Back at her apartment, Sarah placed the metallic capsule on the kitchen table. The small space, which still felt unfamiliar after only a few weeks in town, was bathed in the stillness of the night. The wind howled outside, rattling against the windows, but she couldn't take her eyes off the object in front of her. The capsule was about the size of a thermos, its surface cold and worn with age. A small latch on the side looked simple but sturdy. With a screwdriver in hand, Sarah carefully twisted the latch until she heard a soft click. The lid came loose with a faint pop, and a metallic, musty smell wafted from inside. She tilted the capsule gently, letting its contents slide onto the table. First came a stack of black and white photographs, all showing the town in various decades. Sarah recognized the Central Park, the church, and the main street, but something about the photos made her heart race. One of them depicted the park lit up for Christmas, but the decorations looked outdated, as if from decades ago. Yet, the Santa Claus statue in the background was exactly the same. Next to the photos were yellowed newspaper clippings, all with headlines referencing mysterious disappearances in Winterbury. Sarah scanned the dates quickly. The cases seemed spread out but consistently occurred on Christmas Eve. Some headlines were vague: "Man vanishes without a trace," or "Family reports child missing on Christmas night." Others were more detailed, mentioning strange lights and unexplained sounds before the disappearances. Amid the clippings was a small voice recorder. Sarah hesitated for a moment before picking up the device. It was old, with worn buttons and a compartment for batteries. To her surprise, it still had power. Pressing play, she heard a distorted noise before a woman's voice came through, low and urgent. "If you found this," the voice began, trembling slightly, "then you're in danger too. The lights. The lights aren't the problem. They're the warning. You need to leave town before it's too late. Please, listen. Time is running out." The recorder crackled and went silent, as if the message had been cut off. Sarah sat there, frozen, her mind racing to process what she had just heard. The voice sounded oddly familiar, though she couldn't place it. What unsettled her most was the final warning: "Time is running out." Trying to shake off her unease, Sarah turned her attention back to the photographs. One detail stood out in a particular image: a child, maybe 7 or 8 years old, standing near the Santa Claus statue. The child had dark hair and wore a heavy coat. Sarah frowned, leaning in to get a closer look. There was something hauntingly familiar about the child's face, the way they stared directly at the camera. That's when Sarah realized it. The child looked eerily like her, though the photo was clearly taken decades before she was born. Her breathing quickened, and she pushed the photo aside as if it were too hot to touch. This couldn't be real. It wasn't possible. A sharp crack outside broke her train of thought. She looked up, her heart pounding. The streetlights were blinking again, forming the same pattern she'd seen at the park, but now faster and more complex. Sarah stood up and walked to the window. The street was empty, the houses dark, but the blinking lights seemed to be guiding her in a specific direction. Without overthinking, she grabbed her coat and headed out. The freezing air hit her face as she followed the trail of lights, each street lamp flickering more intensely as she passed. The path led her back to the Central Park, where the Santa Claus statue loomed over the snow-covered ground. The blinking lights surrounding the park had intensified, as if they were desperately trying to communicate. Suddenly, all the lights went out at once. The silence that followed was even heavier than before, as if sound itself had been sucked out of the air. Sarah stood still, her heart pounding in her chest. The darkness lasted only a few seconds but felt like an eternity. When the lights came back on, their pattern had changed again, blinking faster, almost frantic. It was like an urgent plea, pushing her to take action. With her phone in hand, Sarah recorded the new pattern, her fingers trembling from both the cold and adrenaline. She didn't know what it meant yet, but she knew it was important. One thing, however, was clear: this wasn't a simple electrical fault. Something, or someone, was trying to communicate, and she needed to find out why. As she made her way back home, the recorder in her bag seemed heavier than it should have been. The words from the recording echoed in her mind: "Time is running out." And that photograph of the child who looked just like her? It was impossible, yet she couldn't ignore what she'd seen. She felt like she was being drawn into something far larger than she could understand, but something that was undeniably tied to her. When she arrived back at her apartment, Sarah locked the door and tried to focus on analyzing the recordings and photos. But her mind couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Looking out the window, she saw the streetlights blinking again. This time, they seemed to form a word. She stepped closer, squinting to make it out. The lights blinked clearly, deliberately, spelling out a single message: "Run." Sarah stepped away from the window, her heart pounding against her ribs. The lights outside continued to blink, forming the same word: "Run." It was as if they were screaming at her to leave, but leave for where? And why? Her fingers gripped the edge of the table as she tried to steady her breathing, her mind spinning between fear and curiosity. Something was happening in Winterbury, something she couldn't explain, but it seemed to revolve entirely around her. She decided she needed answers, even if it meant confronting the unknown. She gathered the photographs, the newspaper clippings, and the voice recorder, stuffing everything into her backpack. The pulsating message from the lights burned in her mind, like a persistent warning she couldn't ignore. As she prepared to step outside again, the wind outside picked up, howling against the windows like a voice demanding her attention. Sarah left the apartment and made her way to the Central Park once more, feeling an invisible pull toward the place. But when she arrived, she found only emptiness. The lights surrounding the square were out, the snow piling in mounds along the benches and trees. The Santa Claus statue loomed even larger in the darkness, its presence unnerving. Sarah approached cautiously, hoping to hear the peculiar hum again, but all was silent. That's when she felt it. Not a sound, but a presence. As though someone was there, watching her from the shadows. She spun around abruptly, but there was no one. Just the cold emptiness of the night. She tried to calm herself, but her breath came out in uneven clouds, and her fingers trembled as she gripped her flashlight. On her way back, something caught her attention. Lights were flickering inside an old building on the edge of town, a barn she'd noticed briefly when she first arrived in Winterbury. It looked abandoned for years, but now its windows glowed faintly, pulsating in a pattern that mimicked the blinking lights she'd seen earlier. Sarah hesitated before deciding to investigate. Perhaps the barn held more answers. When she reached the barn, she saw that the main door was slightly ajar, creaking faintly in the wind. She pushed it open carefully, the sound echoing through the vast, empty space. Inside, the scent of aged wood mingled with a metallic tang. Beams of light seeped from a corner of the barn, where a cluster of old crates and strange equipment were piled. Sarah moved closer, her footsteps crunching against the straw-covered floor. The equipment looked out of place, a mix of outdated and unfamiliar technology. Cables snaked across the floor, connecting to devices she couldn't identify. Among the items was a notebook filled with handwritten notes. The handwriting was rushed and barely legible, but a few phrases stood out: light frequencies, time, and cycle. One page was marked with a drawing of the Santa Claus statue, with lines diagramming something beneath its base. Sarah's chest tightened. It confirmed what she already suspected: there was more beneath that statue than just electrical wiring. As she flipped through the notebook, she heard a noise behind her. A creak, like a footstep on old wood. Sarah froze, clutching the notebook tightly. Her eyes scanned the shadows around her, but she saw nothing. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. Only silence answered. The sound came again, closer this time. Sarah backed away, her breathing shallow. She spotted a shadow in the far corner of the barn, a faint silhouette of someone wearing a hood. Her heart leapt into her throat. She blinked, and the shadow was gone. The cold seemed to seep deeper into her bones as she grabbed the notebook and bolted out of the barn. Outside, the snow was thicker, slowing her steps as she ran toward her car. Behind her, the lights in the barn flickered and then went dark. It was as if the place had returned to its abandoned state, void of any life or activity. She climbed into her car, locking the doors and gripping the steering wheel tightly, the notebook pressed against her chest. She needed to get back home, organize her thoughts, and figure out what the hell was happening. When she returned to her apartment, Sarah spread the notebook, photographs, and clippings across the table. Each piece seemed connected, but the answers still eluded her. The drawing of the Santa Claus statue in the notebook made her think again about the compartment she'd found earlier. It seemed there was something more hidden beneath the statue, something she hadn't uncovered yet. She knew she would have to return to the park, but the thought of facing that emptiness and the feeling of being watched made her stomach churn. Flipping through the notebook again, one line stood out, underlined multiple times: "The lights are not the danger. They are the warning." It explained the strange patterns she'd seen, but who, or what, was controlling them? And why? Sarah realized that while the lights seemed to be guiding her, there was something or someone else manipulating the situation. The sound of footsteps in the hallway snapped her out of her thoughts. It was late, and most of the building's residents were likely asleep. Sarah held her breath, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped just outside her door, and the silence returned. She moved slowly toward the door, gripping a screwdriver she'd left on the counter as an improvised weapon. Peering through the peephole, she saw nothing but the empty corridor dot. When she opened the door cautiously, she found something unexpected: a folded piece of paper, taped to the doorknob. Sarah's hands shook slightly as she picked up the note. She unfolded it carefully, revealing a message scrawled in large, uneven letters: "Do not trust the light." Sarah stared at the piece of paper in her hands for several seconds, unable to take her eyes off the message. Do not trust the light. It contradicted everything she'd started to piece together so far. The lights seemed to be guiding her, helping her uncover clues, but the note suggested otherwise. Were they a trap? Who had left the note? And more importantly, why were they following her? Still without answers, Sarah tucked the paper into her bag alongside the notebook and the other evidence. The silence in her apartment felt heavier now, as if something unseen was waiting for her next move. Every shadow that passed her window made her heart race. The following morning, she decided to return to the barn. The idea seemed reckless, but there was something about that place she couldn't shake. The strange equipment, the cryptic notes, and the feeling that the barn held more than she had seen. With the notebook in hand, Sarah drove along the snow-covered roads, her car's engine humming against the icy stillness outside. The blinking lights from the night before felt distant now, but the unease remained. When she arrived at the barn, she noticed the door she had left slightly open was now firmly shut. The old wooden structure, weathered and leaning with age, looked almost fortified, as though someone had returned to ensure no one else entered. Sarah frowned and peered through the cracks, but the darkness inside was impenetrable. She grabbed a crowbar she'd brought with her and carefully pried the door open again. Inside, the barn looked different. The crates she'd seen the night before were gone, leaving only marks on the floor that hinted something heavy had been dragged away. In the corner, however, the cables and strange equipment remained. A faint light pulsed from a dusty monitor, casting an eerie glow across the room. Sarah moved cautiously toward it, her eyes scanning for any sign of movement. On the monitor's screen, a series of numbers and letters flickered, shifting in regular intervals. It didn't seem random, but it made no immediate sense to her. Beside the monitor was another notebook, older and more weathered than the first. Its pages were filled with diagrams and schematics, most of them focused on the Santa Claus statue and the lights surrounding the park. One line in particular caught her attention: the source is underground. They don't know. It controls everything. Sarah felt a chill run through her. Something, or someone, was controlling the lights in the town, but to what end? The disappearances, the warnings, all seemed to tie back to the statue and the mysterious power beneath it. As she turned the page, she found a newspaper clipping tucked between the sheets. The headline read, "Engineer disappears while working on town's power grid." The article featured a photograph of a tall man with dark hair, smiling next to a newly installed light post. Sarah scanned the details. The engineer had vanished 5 years ago, on December 24th, while performing maintenance in the Central Park. The last person to see him was Mayor Everett, who claimed the man had seemed agitated before he disappeared. Sarah's stomach churned. This man's disappearance seemed directly connected to the lights, and Everett clearly knew more than he'd let on. A shadow moved past the barn's open doorway, breaking her concentration. Sarah froze, clutching the notebook tightly. Her eyes darted around the room, but she saw nothing. Her heart pounded as she edged toward the door, listening for any sound that might confirm she wasn't alone. The silence was absolute, save for the faint hum of the monitor. When she turned back to the screen, the sequence of numbers and letters had changed. It now displayed a countdown. Sarah stared at the numbers flashing on the screen: 5:23, 5:22, 5:21. Her mind raced. What would happen when the timer hit 0? Without wasting time, she snapped a photo of the screen and grabbed the notebook before rushing out of the barn. Something was about to happen, and she needed to figure out what it was before it was too late. Snow crunched beneath her boots as she made her way back to the car, the feeling of being followed growing stronger with every step. She glanced over her shoulder repeatedly, but the path behind her was empty. Even so, she couldn't shake the sensation of eyes on her. Once back in her apartment, Sarah laid out the notebooks, clippings, and photographs on the table. The older notebook mentioned a source underground controlling the town's lights, while the article about the missing engineer hinted that he had discovered something critical before vanishing. The countdown on the monitor made it clear that time was running out, but for what? Sarah decided she needed to confront Everett again. The mayor clearly knew more than he was letting on, and she was tired of being left in the dark. She packed up her notes, the recorder, and the notebooks, and drove to the town hall. When she arrived, the receptionist informed her that Everett was in a meeting, but she insisted on waiting in the lobby. As she sat there, her eyes wandered to a large photo display on the wall showing the town's history. One image, in particular, grabbed her attention. It was a photo of the Santa Claus statue's unveiling, taken decades earlier. In the image, a group of people smiled proudly next to the freshly constructed statue. Sarah recognized the missing engineer immediately, but what truly unnerved her was another figure in the background. A woman with dark hair who looked exactly like her. The ground seemed to shift beneath her feet as she stared at the image. What did this mean? Was it a coincidence? Or was something far more complex at play? Before she could process her thoughts, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning around, she found herself face to face with Everett, his expression a mix of surprise and something else she couldn't quite place. "We need to talk," Sarah said, clutching the notebook tightly. Everett hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Come with me," he said, leading her into his office. Sarah sat across from Mayor Everett, watching as he shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The office was small and stifling, with wooden shelves lined with folders and books that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. On the desk, a pendulum clock ticked steadily, filling the tense silence between them. Sarah placed the notebook on the desk, forcing the mayor to look at it. "I know you're hiding something," she began, trying to keep her voice steady. "The lights, the disappearances, the engineer who vanished, this isn't just a coincidence. You need to tell me what's going on." Everett sighed and rubbed his face with his hands. He looked exhausted, as if carrying the weight of something he had tried to bury for years. "Sarah, there are some things you shouldn't meddle with," he said, his voice low and almost somber. "Winterbury is an old town, with a history most people wouldn't understand. The lights, they're not just technology. They're part of something bigger, something that started long before any of us." Sarah crossed her arms, her impatience growing. "Something bigger?" That's not an answer. People are disappearing, and you're sitting here pretending like there's nothing you can do about it. Everett suddenly stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. "You think I haven't tried?" he snapped, frustration breaking through his usual calm demeanor. "I've spent years trying to understand what's happening here. I've talked to experts, brought in engineers, even archaeologists. They all disappeared or ran away before finding any real answers. And now you're messing with forces you can't control." Sarah was quiet for a moment, taking in his words. Something in his expression told her he wasn't lying, but it only raised more questions. If you can't control it, why not warn people? Why keep this a secret? Everett sat back down, his exhaustion evident in every movement. "Because no one would believe me. And those who do, well, they'd rather not know." Sarah took a deep breath, leaning forward. "Then tell me what you know. I'm already involved whether I like it or not." After a long pause, Everett finally began to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. He told her about the Santa Claus statue and how it had been built over a site that, according to old records, had unusual properties. No one knew exactly what was beneath it, but during construction, workers reported strange phenomena, lights that seemed to dance on their own, sounds with no discernible source, and an unnatural cold that seeped into their bones, even on warm days. Some believed the site was cursed, others thought it was sacred. But the town decided to move forward, and the statue was completed. Ever since then, the lights started acting up, Everett explained. At first, we thought it was just electrical issues. But then the disappearances began, always near Christmas. Always people who got too close to whatever it is under there. Sarah's stomach tightened. His words confirmed her suspicions, but so much still didn't make sense. And the engineer? What did he find before he disappeared? Everett hesitated before answering. He believed there was something buried beneath the statue, something causing the phenomena. He wanted to dig it up, but he vanished before he could. No one ever saw him again. The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Sarah knew she had to see for herself. The clues she had found in the barn and the notebook all pointed to something hidden under the statue, and she couldn't ignore it. She stood abruptly, grabbing her things. "I'm going there," she said firmly. Everett rose to his feet as well, his eyes wide with alarm. "You can't. Not alone." "Then come with me," Sarah shot back. But Everett shook his head slowly, fear etched into his face. "I can't. Not after what happened last time." Sarah left without another word. The snow was falling heavier now, covering the streets in a blinding white layer. When she arrived at the Central Park, the silence felt even more oppressive than before. The Santa Claus statue loomed over her, its presence cold and imposing. She shivered, remembering Everett's warning, too close to the truth. With a shovel from her car, Sarah began digging around the base of the statue, ignoring the freezing wind biting at her face and fingers. After several minutes of effort, she heard the sound of metal scraping against metal. Clearing the snow, she uncovered a circular metallic lid. There were inscriptions along the edge, but the ice made them difficult to read. She brushed the surface with her glove and managed to make out the words, "Those who enter, do not return." Her heart pounded in her chest, the warning sending a wave of fear through her. But she didn't back away. Using the tools she'd brought, she pried the lid open, revealing a narrow tunnel that descended into darkness. A rusty iron ladder led downward, and an intense cold emanated from the opening, colder than anything she'd felt before. Sarah hesitated, staring into the void below. But curiosity, or something stronger, overpowered her fear. She grabbed her flashlight and began descending, each rung of the ladder creaking under her weight. The darkness swallowed her as she went deeper, the only sound her own shallow breaths. At the bottom, she found a narrow stone corridor. The walls were damp, covered in patches of moss, and the air was thick, almost suffocating. At the end of the corridor was a metal door with a strange symbol carved into it, a circle intersected by lines, resembling a clock without hands. The door was slightly ajar, and faint blinking lights spilled out from within. Sarah pushed it open carefully and stepped inside. The room was small, filled with old machines and cables that ran into the walls and ceiling. A large table in the center was cluttered with papers and tools that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. At the far end of the room was a generator-like structure, pulsating with a faint blue light that emitted a constant, low hum. Sarah stepped closer, the sound vibrating through her chest. Whatever was happening in Winterbury, this machine was at the center of it. The machine pulsed softly, each vibration echoing off the stone walls around it. Sarah stood still for a moment, staring at the strange device in front of her. The blue light emitted by the generator seemed alive, flickering like a flame that refused to go out. She took a step closer, the hum growing louder with each movement. The air in the room felt heavy, almost difficult to breathe, and there was a metallic scent that seemed to emanate from the machine itself. On the central table, scattered among cables and rusted tools, were documents and diagrams. Some showed detailed schematics of what appeared to be an intricate electrical system, but others were stranger, filled with symbols and calculations Sarah couldn't fully understand. One document caught her eye, a map of Winterbury, with lines connecting the town's light posts, all converging at the Central Park. Her fingers traced the map as she tried to make sense of it. The lines formed a network, something far more complex than simple electrical wiring. The machine in the underground chamber seemed to be the core of the system, a power source connected to the lights. Sarah's thoughts raced. Could this be what the missing engineer had discovered before he vanished? And if so, why was it tied to the disappearances? As she sifted through the papers, something drew her attention, a small panel on the right side of the generator. A screen displayed a series of numbers, shifting steadily downward. It was a countdown. Sarah stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the glowing digits as they ticked away. 3:57. 3:56. 3:55. It was the same pattern she had seen on the monitor in the barn. Time was running out, but what would happen when the countdown reached 0? She ran her fingers over the panel, searching for buttons or switches to pause or stop the process, but the surface was smooth and unresponsive. The hum of the machine grew louder, almost as if reacting to her presence. Then she noticed something etched into the side of the generator. The letters were faint, nearly worn away, but she could just make out the words, "Restoring balance requires sacrifice." A chill ran down her spine. What did that mean? Sacrifice of what, or whom? The phrase echoed in her mind, and suddenly everything began to make sense. The disappearances, the blinking lights, the warnings, they weren't random. This machine wasn't just a power source, it was something much greater, something interfering with the fabric of time itself. Sarah remembered what Everett had told her about the underground site and the strange phenomena reported during the statue's construction. This place, this machine, was situated at a critical point where time and space seemed to bend. And now, she was standing at the heart of it, staring at a countdown that refused to stop. The sound of footsteps reverberated through the corridor, snapping Sarah out of her thoughts. She turned quickly, the beam of her flashlight shaking in her hands. Who else knew about this place? The footsteps grew louder, and soon a figure emerged from the darkness. It was Mayor Everett. He was out of breath, his eyes wide as they darted from Sarah to the machine. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice trembling. "I had to see it for myself," Sarah replied. "You knew about this all along. You knew this machine was behind the disappearances." Everett shook his head, his face pale. "It's not that simple. This machine, it maintains balance. Without it, the entire town would collapse into chaos. The disappearances are an unfortunate consequence, but a necessary one." Necessary? Sarah's voice rose, disbelief and anger boiling within her. "You're saying it's okay for people to vanish so this thing can keep running?" Everett took a step forward, his shoulders slumping. "I didn't choose this. It's something that's always been here, something no one can change. I tried to shut it down once, but I nearly lost everything." The lights went out, and the town froze. Like time itself had stopped. Sarah turned back to the countdown. 2:15. 2:14. Time was slipping away, and she couldn't just stand there. "And what happens when this countdown hits 0? She asked, her voice calmer now but no less urgent. Everett hesitated. "I don't know for sure. But the last time this happened was when the engineer disappeared. He tried to interfere, and..." Sarah didn't need him to finish the sentence. The engineer had tried to shut the machine down, and it had cost him his life. But if he believed it was possible to stop the machine, maybe there was a way to do it without destroying everything. She approached the generator again, studying every detail. Next to the countdown panel, she noticed a small slot, almost as if it were designed to hold a key or a device. "What's this?" she asked, pointing to the opening. Everett's face fell. "The capsule. It's the key. But using it could have irreversible consequences. Sarah felt the weight of the capsule in her backpack. She pulled it out and stared at it for a moment, running her fingers over its metallic surface. It wasn't just a container for clues, it was the key to shutting down the machine. But it was also the key to maintaining the balance Everett feared losing. She glanced at the countdown again. 1:10. 1:09. There wasn't much time to decide. Everett stepped back, shaking his head. Don't do this. You don't know what could happen. And letting this continue is acceptable to you? Sarah shot back. How many more people have to disappear so this town can pretend everything's fine? He didn't answer. He just stood there, his eyes locked on the generator. Sarah felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She knew that if she used the capsule to shut the machine down, it could stop the disappearances, but it might also trigger something far worse. Yet if she did nothing, the cycle would continue, and more lives would be lost. Her hands trembling, Sarah inserted the capsule into the slot. The machine reacted immediately, vibrating violently as the blue light intensified. Everett shouted something, but his voice was drowned out by the deafening hum. The pressure in the room seemed to shift, as if the air itself were being pulled toward the generator. And then everything stopped. The silence that followed the capsule's activation was absolute, almost suffocating. Sarah remained frozen, her eyes locked on the generator as the blue light flickered one last time before fading completely. For a moment, she thought everything had stopped, that the machine was finally shut down. But then, a deep sound, like distant thunder, began to rumble through the chamber. The ground trembled faintly beneath her feet, and Sarah gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. The lights on the generator's panel flickered wildly, shifting between colors she had never seen before. The air grew heavier, colder, and harder to breathe, as if something was being pulled out of the atmosphere itself. She turned to look at Everett, who stood frozen in the doorway, his face pale with terror. "I told you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Sarah ignored him, focusing instead on the machine. She had made her choice, but now she wasn't sure what she had set into motion. The countdown had disappeared from the panel, replaced by a strange symbol, a circle with intersecting lines, resembling a clock with no hands. It was the same symbol she had seen etched into the capsule and the generator's casing. Suddenly, the blue light returned, brighter and more intense than before. The hum of the machine grew louder, and Sarah felt a shift in the air around her. It was as if time itself was slowing down, every movement dragging like molasses. She tried to take a step back, but her body felt sluggish, each action requiring immense effort. She glanced at Everett again, but he was still motionless, as if frozen in place. "Everett," she shouted, her voice sounding distorted, as if underwater. He didn't respond. It was as if he were trapped in a different reality, suspended in time. Panic surged through Sarah as she realized the machine was pulling her closer, an invisible force drawing her toward the pulsating light. As she struggled against the pull, the blue light began to shift and change. It wasn't just light, it was a window. Images started to flicker within it, like fragments of memories that didn't belong to her. She saw people she didn't recognize but somehow felt connected to. She saw places she had never been but that seemed hauntingly familiar. And then, amid the swirling images, she saw herself. The first image was of the child from the photograph, smiling near the Santa Claus statue. Then came another version of herself, younger, walking through Winterbury as though she had always belonged there. The images kept shifting, showing her in different times, always tied to the town. Sarah's chest tightened as the realization hit her. What did this mean? Had she always been connected to Winterbury? Or was she caught in a loop she couldn't escape? The generator began to vibrate violently, snapping her back to the present. The blue light flickered erratically, and the hum grew into a deafening roar. Sarah knew she had to act before the machine tore everything apart. She scanned the panel desperately, looking for something, anything, that could stabilize it. But there were no buttons, no switches, no obvious controls. The only thing left was the capsule, now fully embedded in the slot. And then she remembered the words etched on the generator: restoring balance requires sacrifice. Her breath hitched as the meaning became clear. The machine wasn't just connected to the lights or the disappearances, it was tied to the very fabric of time itself. Every person who had vanished, every strange occurrence in Winterbury, was part of a larger cycle. The machine was trying to correct something, but that correction came at a cost. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as the truth settled in. To restore balance, something, or someone, had to be given up. And in that moment, she knew what she had to do. She glanced at Everett one last time. He remained frozen, his wide eyes staring blankly into the room. Sarah took a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she reached for the panel. The blue light seemed to react to her decision, growing brighter and more intense, enveloping her in its glow. She felt the pull strengthen, dragging her closer to the generator. The roar of the machine filled her ears, drowning out every other sound. As the light consumed her, Sarah caught one final glimpse of Winterbury. She saw the snow-covered streets, the lights shining steadily without flickering, and people reappearing as though they had never been gone. The town was waking up, its balance restored. But she knew she would never be part of it again. The light grew blinding, and the roar of the machine faded into a deafening silence. For a moment, there was nothing but peace. No fear, no pain, just an overwhelming calm. Sarah felt herself slipping away, her connection to the world dissolving. She knew her sacrifice would go unnoticed, her existence erased. But it didn't matter. The town was safe, and that was enough. In the chamber beneath the Santa Claus statue, the blue light vanished, and the machine went silent. Everett collapsed to his knees, gasping for air as if he had just awakened from a nightmare. He looked around the darkened room, his chest heaving as he tried to process what had happened. There was no sign of Sarah. The capsule, the light, the humming, all of it was gone. He stumbled out of the tunnel, emerging into the park. The snow was falling gently now, blanketing the ground in a pristine layer of white. The lights around the square glowed steadily, casting a warm, comforting glow over the town. Children were playing in the snow, their laughter carrying through the crisp air, and families gathered around the park, oblivious to the events that had just unfolded. Everett stood at the base of the Santa Claus statue, his eyes fixed on its towering form. He felt a lump rise in his throat as he whispered, "Thank you." He knew no one would hear him, but he said it anyway. Dawn broke quietly, bringing a stillness to Winterbury that the town hadn't felt in years. The streets were blanketed in pristine snow, and the Christmas lights shone steadily, unbroken and warm, as if they had been perfected overnight. In the Central Park, the Santa Claus statue stood tall, no longer ominous in the daylight but instead appearing calm, almost welcoming. Children emerged from their homes, their laughter filling the streets as they ran to play in the snow and unwrap presents under glittering Christmas trees. Families gathered, their voices carrying the warmth of the holiday spirit. But for Everett, Christmas would never be the same. He watched the park from the window of his office at Town Hall, the scene outside looking almost too perfect, too ordinary. He sipped his coffee absent-mindedly, unable to focus on anything except the events of the previous night. No one mentioned the flickering lights or the disappearances. For the people of Winterbury, Christmas Eve had been like any other, an unremarkable celebration. Only Everett knew the truth. Only he carried the weight of what had been done to restore the town's fragile balance. Setting his cup down, he leaned against the window frame, his eyes distant. The image of Sarah lingered in his mind. Her determination, her courage, and the sacrifice she made. She had done what he had been too afraid to attempt, and because of her, the town was safe. But at what cost? No one remembered her. It was as if she had never existed. Determined to uncover something, anything that would prove Sarah's presence, Everett left his office and walked through the snow toward the park. The square was alive with families enjoying the holiday, children racing each other down snow-covered paths, and couples holding hands as they admired the decorations. No one gave the Santa Claus statue a second glance, but Everett couldn't take his eyes off it. As he approached, his steps slowed. The statue loomed over him, its jovial face hiding the darkness buried beneath. He knelt at the base of the statue, brushing away the snow with his gloves. The ground appeared undisturbed, there was no sign of the metallic lid or the tunnel leading to the chamber below. It was as if it had never existed. Frustrated, Everett ran his fingers over the stone, searching for any trace of what had happened. That's when he found it. Partially buried in the snow was a small glass capsule. Its surface glinted faintly in the sunlight, and inside was a folded piece of paper. Everett picked it up carefully, his breath catching in his throat as he opened the capsule and unfolded the note. The handwriting was familiar, hurried but legible, for those who seek answers. Never forget. His chest tightened as he read the words. It was a message from Sarah, the only evidence that she had been real, that she had saved them all. He closed his eyes, clutching the paper as a wave of emotion swept over him. He wanted to shout her name, to tell the world about her sacrifice, but he knew he couldn't. The balance had been restored, and no one could disturb it again. As Everett stood, he noticed something else. A crowd had gathered around the base of the statue, murmuring softly. An older woman named Clara, one of the town's longtime residents, had stopped to examine a new plaque that seemed to have appeared overnight. The polished metal bore an inscription, simple yet profound, in memory of the balance and those who protect it. "Did you know about this?" Clara asked, looking at Everett as he approached. He shook his head, his voice catching in his throat. "No. I didn't." The crowd read the inscription in silence, some nodding as if it made sense to them on a level they couldn't fully articulate. No one questioned who had placed the plaque there or why. It felt like a fitting tribute, though none of them could explain why they felt that way. As the day went on, the square filled with life. Music played from hidden speakers, families shared stories over steaming cups of cocoa, and the town seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The lights that had once flickered unpredictably now glowed with a steady, warm brilliance. The memories of past disappearances seemed distant, almost forgotten, but Everett couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered. That evening, as the sun set and the park lights came to life, another discovery was made. A photograph had been placed at the base of the statue, nestled carefully in the snow. The image showed a woman standing beside the Santa Claus statue, smiling faintly. It was Sarah. No one in the town recognized her, but as they passed by the photograph, many paused to look at it. There was something familiar about her face, something comforting, though no one could place her in their memories. Everett, however, knew exactly who she was. He retrieved the photograph and held it tightly, the weight of her sacrifice hitting him anew. Back in his office, Everett placed the photo in a simple wooden frame and set it on his desk. It would remain there as a reminder, not just of Sarah, but of the fragile balance she had restored. Though no one else remembered her, Everett vowed never to forget. The days passed, and Winterbury returned to its routine. That Christmas was remembered as one of the most peaceful in years, with no strange occurrences or unexplained disappearances. The machine beneath the statue remained silent, its purpose fulfilled for now. The town moved on, blissfully unaware of the forces that had once threatened to unravel it. But Everett knew the balance was delicate. As Christmas approached the following year, he found himself drawn back to the park. Snow fell gently as he stood before the statue, the air crisp and quiet. The plaque still gleamed at its base, untouched by time or weather. Something caught his eye, a faint inscription beneath the plaque, almost invisible beneath a fresh layer of snow. Everett knelt down and brushed the snow away, his breath fogging the cold air. The words etched into the stone were chillingly simple: the balance is kept. For now. He sat back on his heels, the weight of those words sinking in. The balance Sarah had restored wasn't permanent. Whatever forces the machine had been holding at bay could return, and if they did, the town might not be so lucky again. As he stood to leave, Everett looked up at the statue one last time. The snow continued to fall, blanketing Winterbury in its serene quiet. The Santa Claus statue stood tall, its jovial face hiding the secrets buried deep below. And though Everett didn't fully understand what had happened or what might come next, he whispered into the cold air, "Thank you, Sarah." The snow fell harder as he walked away, covering the statue's inscription, the plaque, and the photograph still tucked safely on his desk. Winterbury was safe, for now.